welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining. This is the final session of the webcast series Epistemologies of Land, sponsored by the Center for Global Knowledge Studies, GLONOS, just introduced by Inanna, and it's also sponsored by CRASH, both institutions in Cambridge. And I want to thank specifically Inanna Hamati-Ataya, who will also speak later today, and who is the founding director of GLONOS and has made all of this possible. And also Sam Peel for organizing the whole series of events. Without you, this would have been a complete chaos. So thank you very, very much. Thank you also to the previous presenters and to the audience. It's been a great couple of weeks, a very committed group of people, and I think we also had some very good outcomes. Hopefully they will be published as an edited volume, and today is the final sort of wrap-up session, and I hope to also engage with the audience and to come up with some guiding questions which will then hopefully also inspire the future work of GLONOS that was just introduced by Inanna. My name is Felix. I work in Frankfurt at the Peace Research Institute, and I am physically in Berlin. Today is the final session, as I said, and it's a little different. It's a round table. We want to both conclude and formulate also pathways for future research. I'm very delighted to be joined by a number of experts on different aspects of land, who have a variety of interesting perspectives on epistemology in this context, and all of them I really wanted to work with. That goes also for the other speakers in this series. So I'm really glad all of that worked out despite difficult circumstances during the pandemic. So in the following, I will give a short overview of what has happened so far, and I will pose a few questions that have emerged from previous talks. And after that, we'll hear short statements by a group of scholars who I think can deliver an interesting set of perspectives to elevate the discussion even further. After that, we'll hopefully have time for an open discussion with all of you. As I said, it's not going to be recorded, so you can be as frank as you want. If you have questions, just put them in the chat or put in your name in the chat, and we'll get to the questions. I asked all the speakers to give us 5 to 7 minutes impressions of the role land plays in their research and the epistemological perspective on land that they utilize. How can we understand the role of land, the role that it plays in different fields of research? And maybe also, how can land bring these different fields of research together? What we've learned in previous webcasts is that this relationship goes both ways. That is to say, it's not only about taking a specific epistemological perspective and then grasping the role of land. Rather, in one way or another, all scholars have shown that land in itself bears a certain form of agency or subjecthood that shapes the way we can understand the history of the social. Epistemologies of land, for me, therefore, have acquired a double meaning. Land can be understood as and made meaningful in quite diverse ways. That is, it matters how we look at land as an object of research. But land also forces us to change our views once we really take it into account. It stores so many memories, assembles so many artifacts, guides so clearly our means of production, offers so many surprises, and influences the ways of connecting to our species and to others, that it isn't just a space in which social relations happen, but it conditions and co-produces those relations. In the first talk of the series, Sakshi has made this quite clear by showcasing land both as a historical artifact that cannot be captured with simple terms such as territory, and a resource for indigenous peoples in front of the court. Indigenous knowledges of the land can be an opportunity to change litigation, as she showed. but it needs a pedagogical intervention in which land is both the context and the process. She has drawn on the ways that indigenous philosophies have been mobilized in this context, enriching the understanding of land and using it as a resource for indigenous communities who make claims for compensation once their land has been taken away. But it is a difficult process in a system that only knows economic compensation and communities whose relation to the land is so much more than that. Leo Steeds in his talk investigated precisely that question, how the land that we know has been made and with what effects. With the methods of intellectual history, he traced the emergence of a discourse in which land is understood primarily or exclusively in terms of the revenues that it might yield to its owner, land as capital. How come that today we almost take it for granted that the land we walk on, is an economic factor? What other understandings of land have there been, and how can we uncover them and make them productive? Eloisa Berman-Arevalo used stories to grasp the meaning of land. Her question started from a dilemma. What's the use of ethnographic and other methods for understanding a people and whose relations to the land and environment has been so distorted by colonial interventions? What else but the reification of relations and of domination can we find? She started off by showing a bunch of maps, saying, I remember this quite specifically, that's what we do as geographers. We always use maps, although we criticize them all the time. In that regard, stories in which the forest and the land were ascribed a mythological and social function proved as an entry point to make visible social lives which had rendered ungeographic by previous interventions. In all those talks, I found it breathtaking how contingent and yet violent the histories of transformation of land into a resource for the few have been, and the similarities in those processes, despite their geographic variation. I cannot not say the word colonialism here. Settlers have been colonizing the land, and the ways in which land has been colonized over centuries colonizes our epistemologies. To understand that has very practical consequences, as for example, Anna Wolkenhaus showed in her talk on social policies in rural Zambia. The so-called evidence-based rural social policies are so intertwined with a particular understanding of land as a resource that despite all the evidence, the outcomes remain destructive and lack emancipation for the rural poor, a goal that I see that very clearly after listening to all of your talks, needs a different understanding of the land on, with, and from they live. This was also highlighted by Shaila Jaffanel, who exposed the interventions of the Green Revolution and showed us how specific grains, such as millets, were degraded by international interventions due to specific discourses around efficiency and development, leaving millions of people with a worse deal and an environment in which suddenly their staple foods are looked down upon and exchanged for some foreign grain. We need to start somewhere else, namely in the lived reality of communities and their understanding of how they work the land. That needs to become the basis for mapping local supply chains, building on local notions of ecological knowledge, which will ascertain what patterns and levels of agricultural productivity these communities are able to achieve and sustain. Our project of land epistemologies may sound very abstract to some, but I think that this is a very clear political consequence and demand that can be formulated on the basis of our collective research. The role that history plays in that context cannot be overstated. And I want to reiterate that, building on the talk of Eduardo Machicado. As an archaeologist, he compared two swamp areas, one in Bolivia and one in England, and blessed us with his analysis and power of imagination. What could have been the society that produced the artifacts we find today? In that regard, land is not only the object which we need history for, but land also tells us something about our history. So the questions remain open, of course, and I asked all the contributors today to tell us something about their understanding of land. and the meaning that land plays in their research. How has their thinking about land shaped their own research? Throughout the webcast, land has figured as a form of history, but there were very different forms of accessing that history. So my question is, what is your take on history and land? Which methodological cues can you learn and have you learned in your research, and which pitfalls of researching land do you see? Initially, I started out framing the issue of land with regard to relationality, relations to the land, on the land, among the lands. I thought that sounds very smart, but I still think it's also quite interesting as a concept to relate to land. But most contributions to the webcast actually didn't use the concept. So my question is also, what is your take on land and relationality? Is there anything to be gained from looking at land through relations, or do you have a critique of that view? So let me briefly introduce the speakers. We'll hear first from Katarina Kušić. Katarina is a scholar of international relations with a focus on social, political, and economic transformations in the Balkans. She is currently a visiting scholar at the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth University and co-convenes the BISA Southeast Europe Working Group. She has written her PhD on youth empowerment and agricultural modernization in Serbia. David Nally is a senior lecturer at the Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge. Focusing on human geography, he convenes the department's Vital Geographies Research Group. He has a PhD in geography from the University of British Columbia. As a member of GLONOS, David has enriched our work with his fascinating research on potatoes and famine, and his publications have strongly influenced my own thinking on the Green Revolution. Bikrum Gill is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Virginia Tech. His research interests are situated at the intersection of international political economy, political ecology, agrarian studies, decolonial studies, critical race theory, and global history. Bikrum has done some important work on land grabbing and how it is related to bigger regimes of exploitation. For example, in his dissertation titled Race, Nature, and Accumulation, a decolonial world ecological analysis of land grabbing, and in the article, Can the River Speak? Epistemological Confrontation in the Rise and Fall of the Land Grab in Gambela, Ethiopia. Maarten Meijer is an expert on soil, a PhD candidate at the University of Groningen. Maarten is interested in the European geopolitics of soil, political ecology, and political philosophy. In his research, he asks about both the understanding of soil throughout time, and he traces the politics of soil and their ecological effects. Finally, Inanna Hamati-Ataya is, as I said, the founding director of GLONOS. She's also the principal investigator on the ERC funded project Artifact. In that capacity, I have to say, she also was my boss. First and foremost, however, Inanna is an internationally acclaimed scholar on historical epistemology and has shaped this webcast series with her anthropological perspective and deep history and the role that agriculture has played in it. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that in the end of this roundtable. So sorry for taking a bit longer than I initially planned, but I hope that you will do better. And we'll start with Katarina. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us.
Great. So hi, everyone. And first of all, a huge thank you to Samantha and Felix and Inanna for organizing this. It's been a huge joy to attending the workshops and reading the papers and thinking with this great group of people. So at the beginning of the workshop series, I think in the original invitation, there was the underlying premise that understanding agrarian relations requires approaching land as a central epistemological dimension and site. And in my short comments, I want to reflect on two aspects of this framing. So first, there is a somewhat paradoxical lure of land in this framing. It is a site of relation when it is itself relational. And this is not to point to some flaw in the framing, but to highlight that this paradox is precisely what makes land so inviting. Our understandings of what soil, territory, or land are depend on particular constellations of human and non-human interactions on multiple scales. And the second point I want to address is a methodological continuation of this conundrum. How might we approach these relations as epistemologically generative beyond the particular concepts through which we are used to understanding them? And I'm going to try to kind of further illustrate this with a few sentences about my PhD research, which led to the project that I'm currently developing, which is on international political ecologies of land in Southeast Europe. So when I did fieldwork in Serbia in 2016, I was studying the Europeanization of agricultural governance. The so-called Western Balkans are in a peculiar position. Even though Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, and Kosovo are not a part of the EU, and many observers agree that membership is not a realistic option, EU integration still functions as the organizing principle of both political imaginaries and practical public policies. The EU membership process proceeds through an immense series of legislative changes that are organized in topical chapters. And out of 35 chapters, 3 relate to agriculture and food systems: agriculture and rural development, food safety, veterinary and phytosanitary policy, and fisheries. In agriculture, this means preparing for the implementation of the Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, with legislative changes that will enable data collecting, processing, and the payment of subsidies. At the same time, the integration process hopes to speed up the structural development of agricultural production to enable producers to compete in the single market. What struck me in 2016, and what is still enticing and drives my research, is the fact that the EU considers land, and especially agricultural land, a national issue, and does not actually require legislative changes beyond incorporating it into the single market under the stipulations on the free movement of capital. In practice, this means that most member states then develop additional legislature to discourage foreign acquisition of agricultural land through non-nationality requirements, place of residence, duration and experience of production, etc. Yet it is abundantly clear that the EU, or to be more precisely CAP, makes land an EU issue. The rise in land prices, the disappearance of small producers, and the competition in the single market have profoundly reshaped new member states that do not fit the EU family farm model. Moreover, the people I spoke to and who are the end users of agricultural policy saw land as an important and contested issue. In addition to the incredibly corrupt process of privatizing agricultural land in the post-war privatization craze of the 1990s, we now see the entry of both EU and so-called non-Western investors into these land markets. In 2016, when I was in Serbia, it seemed that land was everywhere and nowhere. And as I began researching how land operates as an object of policy in both EU and national contexts, I was struck by the limitations of such a conceptualization. Even in policies, land appeared as different relations, as a point of national pride, as family and often ethnic attachment, as capital, a resource, and as history. And at the same time, the agrarian relations that were unfolding on this land pointed to much more than the land itself. I was led to international relations that led Yugoslavia abandon Soviet-style collectivizations early in its socialist development, to the non-aligned solidarities so materially and ideologically invested in the modernization process supposed to solve the peasant question through industrialization, and the slow violence unfolding in many villages I visited, where there was no spectacular land grab or dispossession, but I encountered roads slowly left to rot, former socially owned cooperatives abandoned to crumble, stories of migration, old age and deprivation, and aborted efforts at collective contestation. And I think, in other words, I saw the social, political, and economic life of soil that did not fit neither the evasion of land by the institutions I was studying, nor my own exclusive research focus on land. I think all of the papers in the series spoke to the social, political, economic, and ecological life of soil. They spoke about the legal systems in which indigenous lands are enmeshed, the political and moral economies of millets, the stories and storytelling that make territory, and the social relations of large-scale drainage projects. But I think they also spoke to the soil life of the social and political, how land makes and is made through discourses of political economy, how particular social welfare policies unfold, and ways in which social movements and geopolitics politicize land. In other words, I think we're talking about two different questions: how we know land through stories, legislature, agricultural policy, transnational movements, and new grain technologies, and what can we know through land, settler colonialism, political economies, and state policies. And what I'd like us all to reflect on are the analytical consequences of these reframings. What do we know land to be if we take seriously its always shifting relational character? In my own work, I aim to make post-socialist rural spaces epistemically generative. I think there is a wider problem of overlooking the global East when talking about political ecologies. And I think this invasion is partially visible in the geographical focus of the series as well. But more than this, I want to highlight the methodological problem that I'm grappling with: how to approach human-soil relations without confining them to specific concepts that we are used to thinking with, be that policy, territory, or property. This is then to ask not only how we can know land through specific relations, but what else we might know from human-soil relations. Thank you very much.
For now, that's great. We'll move to the next speaker, David Nally. Thank you very much, Katarina.
Right. Thank you, Inanna. Thank you, Felix and Samantha. Thank you for your organizational skills, and to all the speakers who've preceded me. I've learned an enormous amount reading through papers and catching up on videos. So thank you. I thought I'd begin with a question. When we think of land, what do we imagine? Maybe we think of hearth, maybe we think of home, or perhaps soil, or animal and plant life, the so-called natural world, or perhaps land connotes history, tradition, or culture. We might note en passant that the word culture is etymologically linked to the word cultivate. Yet in his foundational book, The Great Transformation, Karl Polanyi points out that under the system of free market capitalism, modern capitalism, land emerges as something completely, radically different. Land is birthed as what he calls a fictitious commodity. Now, by fictitious commodity, Polanyi means that land is treated as if it were a marketable asset, something that exists solely to be bought, sold, and owned. So Polanyi means fictitious in a very specific way. Land is constructed as commodity, and thus a land market is made. But in the process, other understandings of land as biosphere, as home, as way of life, these are bracketed off, they're diminished, they're occluded. I think in sum, Polanyi helpfully reminds us that from the perspective of capital, land is only nature as it exists in commodified form. And in my comments, I will use the term property, or better still, private property, to denote land as commodity. And I think there are kind of three ways that we can work with Polanyi's important reflections. First, I think we can kind of stick close to Polanyi's original ideas and think about the knowledge strategies or the knowledge tactics used to produce land as commodity. And this is something Leo Steeds did really well, I think, in his talk. This involves thinking through the history and philosophy of ideas, engaging with orthodox economic thinkers like Locke, Ricardo, Malthus, Smith, many more, and asking questions such as, how does the notion of exclusive private property arise? How was it theorized, and how was it intellectually sanctioned? What were the ideas, and how were they spatially diffused around the world? In other words, thinking through the relationship between capitalism and colonialism, and also what countervailing ideas challenged this notion of absolute property. So drawing on socialist, feminist, Marxist, and indigenous critiques, which I'll do momentarily. However, I think there's a second way to proceed that's perhaps closer to the way I look at the legacy of Polanyi's work, and that is to take his idea of fictitious commodities into the realm of use, to go beyond epistemology, to consider the vital material practices, the physical instruments and technologies used to make land private. So here I'm thinking of the work of scholars such as Patricia Seed, her brilliant book, Ceremonies of Possession, or Alan Greer's great recent book, Property and Dispossession. In different but complementary ways, both these scholars focus on what I'd call acts of possession, not just the making of property laws, but the very prosaic ways that land as property was secured, the building of homes, the erection of farm dwellings, the planting of gardens, the fencing and hedging of perimeters. These scratches on the surface of land were ways of registering presence and devalorizing the presence of others, that is, of claiming ownership. So drawing on Patricia Seed, we might say that the prosaic act of fencing is ownership presented in commodified form, in object form. By contrast, Alan Greer focuses on the more formal ways that land is controlled and appropriated. For Greer, the ability to calculate areas, distances, angles, and directions is important. The use of cadastral maps to distill complex ideas about land data, and the deployment of writing technologies to produce property deeds. All of these are inscription devices that played a crucial role in the spatialization of the property form. Now, we could lump all of this together and say it's part of the history of ideas, and say that Cartesian modernity or the mathematization of space, these are important events in extending commercial and political control over land. But I would want to stress that these are material and embodied practices, not merely imaginative acts, and that they helped actualize on the ground a whole new way of relating to land. So the studies by Greer and Seed center on the New World, and thus the story of European colonialism looms large. But there's a third point I want to make. The production of land as marketable asset was hotly contested, especially in the extra-European world. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that there are other epistemic traditions that resist the mine and thine exclusions embedded in the notion of ownership. In other words, there are other epistemes that promote non-extractive modes of engagement with land. And learning from these traditions must be central to developing what conservation ecologist Aldo Leopold called a land ethic. I therefore want to make two final comments on this land ethic. I'll stick with Europe for a moment, because there the process of enclosure was central to making land a fictitious commodity. And there's a rich body of literature here from E.P. Thompson right through to Peter Linebaugh that traces the destruction of the commons and the peasant moral economy that attended enclosure. Specifically, I'm thinking about a whole slew of usufruct rights that over time are debased and undermined. The right to pick stray stalks of grain from other people's land, called gleaning. Pannage, meaning the right to pasture pigs in wood and forest. Piscary, meaning the right of access to waterways to obtain aquatic foods. Estovers, the right to take timber for fuel, for tool making, to repair one's home. And aegissement, the grazing rights for animals in particular seasons and in particular periods. These customary laws undergirded the notion of common ownership, but they also form the material basis of subsistence. Or said differently, it's through the commons that peasants enjoyed direct access, i.e. non-market access to the means of living. And thus it's the enclosure of land, the splintering of the commons, an act of deterritorialization that is the prelude to the building of a commercial attachment to land. To be clear, I'm not trying to romanticize subsistence, but I do think that some of these practices, the practices of the commons, contain germinal ideas that we might revivify. Ideas about redistributive justice and reciprocal care, ideas about sustainable use and the right to subsistence, and ideas about sufficiency or the notion of affluence without abundance, to quote Marshall Salins. In a world in which mainstream economic conversations now feature discussions on degrowth and the concept of enoughness, sufficiency, perhaps a land ethic that embraced the epistemology of the commons could be resonant or made resonant again. And this leads me to my last point. I believe we also have a great deal to learn from indigenous cosmologies and lifeways, a theme picked up brilliantly in earlier discussions by Eloisa and Sakshi. In her provocative book, Braiding Sweetgrass, biologist and citizen of the Potawatomi Nation, Robin Wall Kimmerer, contrasts what she calls the settler view with the participatory consciousness of indigenous peoples. She writes, in the settler mind, land was property, real estate, capital, natural resources. But to our people, it was everything: identity, the connection to our ancestors, the homes of our non-human kinfolk, our pharmacy, our library, the source of everything that sustained us. Our lands were where our responsibility to the world was enacted. I love that sentiment. Among other things, Kimmerer reminds us that we live in a reciprocal relationship or co-evolutionary partnership with other organisms. Indeed, the entirety of animal life, which has an aerobic nature, feeds off the organic exchange of gases between vegetative life. So no plant, no breath. All life is the gift of other life. We are just one life form embedded in a multitude of symbiotic attachments. This is what Arturo Escobar calls radical relationality. So I got in relationality there, Felix. So indigenous teachers can help us to understand various principles, just like the commons can help us understand various principles. Principles of the honorable harvest, the importance of polycultural production, which Shaila picked up on, how to dwell and live honorably in a multi-species commons. And this is important, I think, because as Kimmerer says, it's not the land that is broken, it's our relationship to it. That's where I'll stop.
Thank you so much, David. Without saying anything, I just want to give the floor to Bikrum.
Thank you. Thank you, Felix, and Samantha and Inanna for organizing this this wonderful discussion. I wasn't able to catch many of the earlier kind of presentations, but I was quite impressed, Felix, with your introduction. You actually stole a lot of my thunder for what I was going to say. So I was thinking, well, you know, we've heard a lot on colonialism and the intersection of land and the social ecological nature. So I've actually on the fly kind of decided to change what I'm going to talk about, because I think a lot of that ground has already been covered, so to speak. And so I'm actually going to try to just maybe discuss some elements of the farmers' protests in India, thinking about actually how there's a particular mode of capital accumulation that bears upon kind of, or it clarifies how epistemology becomes a site of contestation, right, for the kind of either the intensification of capital accumulation in agriculture or its potential overturning, right? And so I'm gonna try to quickly just read out of sections of a paper I just wrote on this. It's in Red Pepper magazine, but I think you need a subscription to read it. So this is my way to share it as well. Before I was going to read this one, I was going to start my discussion with Fanon. And so I just wanted to briefly mention, like, the question of how does land inform our research? Like, for me, the people often forget, right? Wretched of the Earth, right? Of course, it's about anti-colonialism, but it has Earth right there in the title, Wretched of the Earth. And, you know, in the second chapter, which is often underread in comparison to Concerning Violence, he really clarifies that it's the peasant, right, who's at the heart of anti-colonialism, because the peasant has not forgot about the centrality of land, right? And what's informing the peasant all the time is how can we get land, right? So in all of our discussion of relationality, rethinking human nature relations and so forth, one cannot also forget kind of how important the denial of sovereignty to certain peoples over land has been to the making of the modern world, to understanding the climate crisis, but also ongoing global inequality, right? And the representation of land in this regards is important to keep in mind. And this is things maybe we can come to in the discussion after, but really to think about how land gets transformed or gets colonized, a big part of that is disarticulating longstanding relations between indigenous peoples and lands, right? So it's to think about land not simply as a setting, not simply as a site of nature to be restored in its pristine essence, but as something that has always been co-constituted. And so like, how would this relate to the farmers' protests in India, right? So I think what's happening in India is you're having an intensification of a mode of accumulation that is actually, and this maybe relates to some of Inanna's, I caught the tail end of Inanna when you were saying this kind of new research project on the fourth industrial revolution. In my view, the kind of an under-discussed element of the farm laws in India and the farmer protests is actually the growing kind of entry into agriculture of a kind of data-driven mode of accumulation, right? So what's been happening is so what are the farm laws in India? These are a series of laws that are seeking to kind of privatize grain trade, right? That are seeking to roll back public procurement of grains that were hard fought and hard won by farmers during the Green Revolution, right? So as post-colonial India is simultaneously unable to follow the Chinese path of a socialist kind of agricultural model and goes the Green Revolution route, nonetheless, it provisions certain public goods, right? And a part of this provisioning was this kind of minimum support price, right? This kind of this price that is set by the state, you know, and also part of this provisioning is providing agricultural extension and access to public agricultural knowledge for farmers, right? And so as now what these laws are seeking to do is to roll back this minimum support price, right? But the motivation of this in many ways is of a kind of a form of agribusiness that is both domestic in India and transnational actors like Cargill and Archer Daniel Midlands, right, that have encountered a serious crisis of profitability, right? So one thing we have to remember with capitalist agriculture is that the margins are very low in the international grain trade, right? Like they have to monopolize and control the grain trades because the profit margins aren't very high. So you want to increase your volumes, right? But one thing that these agribusiness corporations have started turning to in the last 20, 30 years is shifting the focus of their activity from the real agricultural economy to what is referred to as the derivative agricultural economy, the financialization of agriculture, right? And in the literature, it has been referred to both the financialization of agriculture and also the agriculturalization of finance, right? Because one strategy to overcoming the financial crisis in 2008 was for capital to flee financial markets, to flee housing markets and enter into agriculture, right? So you had this convergence between an agribusiness that was seeking or discovering it could generate much higher and quicker profits, rapid profits, right? Not through the actual physical grain trade, but through the derivative trade, right? So through selling kind of futures contracts that in some ways are necessary for farmers to kind of be able to survive between planting and harvest, right? These are instruments that were developed for a variety of reasons. But for a lot of agribusiness, there's been a discovery that they can make a lot more profit, right? By engaging in the sale of these pieces of paper rather than in the actual grain trade. So what does this have to do with the farm laws and with the question of data that I raised earlier, right? So something that agribusiness firm like Cargill has been increasingly, and Cargill is perhaps the largest agribusiness corporation in the world. It's centered in the United States. It's quite massive and has been implicated in overturning governments all over the world to access kind of agricultural frontier lands, right? So Cargill has increasingly been advertising itself as an investment fund manager, right? So it's been trying to attract large pension funds to say, hey, the most secure form of investment for you post 2008 is to hand us your money and we can generate quick and sustained profits through this derivative agricultural economy. Because why? Because we have access to data across the world, right? In a way nobody else does. Now we have access to people on the ground in India, in Africa, in South America. We know first when a flood is happening. We know first when a drought is happening, right? We know when there's political conflict. So the farm laws in India in many ways is shifting the kind of the locus or the area through which farmers interact with marketing their grains. The idea is to shift it from a public procurement system to these apps, right? These agribusiness corporations have developed kind of apps. And so the idea now is for farmers, since they can't sell to the state, right, to download smart apps on their phones and to then sell their grains supposedly to the highest bidder, right, through this smart app, And this way it's supposed to be the most efficient system. And then consumers can use these same apps, right? So it's a farm to fork system. But what is it in fact doing? It's provisioning the knowledge that farmers have of their kind of day-to-day agricultural activity. It's enabling agribusiness to have direct access to that, right? To the kind of everyday problems they might be having with water, with droughts, with other sorts of issues. So it can configure and it can process that data on a large scale and repackage it, right? And sell it to financial investors to say, like, look, we know when to buy low and sell high, right? Like this is a way in which now we can actually generate higher profits from a grain trade that has historically been beset by crises of overproduction, by problems of low margins, right? But it still remains premised upon the continual kind of disarticulation or separation, right? Or non-recognition of the knowledge that farmers have of kind of their everyday agricultural activities, right? So I think there's something that I just wanted to maybe enter that into the discussion, is how does like the agriculturalization of finance and the financialization of agriculture, like how might this make us rethink something like the epistemology of land, right? And it's something that the farmers are clearly rejecting in India, right? They're very clearly demanding and continuing to fight for a public kind of procurement system, continuing to demand public support in terms of agricultural extension agents, in terms of public agricultural knowledge, right? So we're having right now an intensification of the privatization of agricultural knowledge, which is in fact an appropriation of the knowledge of farmers on the ground for the purpose of data collection and processing, which is ultimately for the purpose of a form of financial speculation and speculation and financialization of agriculture. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Bikrum. Thank you very much. We'll now move to Maarten. Maybe you say your name again, because my Dutch is so bad. I'd say Maarten Meijer. Is that correct?
I thought it was fine. Maarten Meijer, I would say, but well, we're in an international setting, so who has the ultimate authority on that?
Thank you for joining us from your holidays, Maarten.
No, absolutely my pleasure. I hope the internet connection is stable enough. I got a notification just now that it's a bit unstable, so if I fall through somewhere, well, please be patient.
Sounds good so far.
Okay, good. Thank you, Felix, Inanna, and Samantha for doing all the organizational work, and thanks also to all the other speakers here in the panel today, but also in the series. Really wonderful talks. Those that I missed, I re-listened to, and yeah, it's very informative and inspiring. So I will address some of the themes, Felix, that you wanted us to address today. In relation to my PhD research on soil governance. So rather than speaking about land directly, I approach these kinds of earthly questions through soil. Soil in this context, I understand as a particular institution of governing natural and social worlds, which might include land. One that changes through time, but also has a series of continuations, and it's those changes and continuities that I'm interested in. And not to equate soil to land might be a little bit counterintuitive, but I think it's important because to me it highlights the multifacetedness of these entities, soils, and lands that we are talking about. So I'm always a bit hesitant with reducing soil to land, because it seems to be to reducing land or soil to any particular aspect, whereas we should take this multifacetedness that also the previous panelists here have alluded to as a starting point of analysis. But simultaneously, I think for me it's important as a move to denaturalize soil. So approaching soil as a particular institution, I feel means approaching it as resting upon particular sites of practice, technology, and knowledge. And this includes, for example, the soil scientists, soil maps, land use policies, but also artifacts like fertilizers, which stabilize and promote particular soil epistemologies. And this denaturalization of soil serves to underline the situatedness of approaches to land and the need of interrogating how the situation of encountering, understanding, and responding to land is constructed, also in an analytical sense. And so in these sites of practice, technology, and knowledge, there's a continuous interaction with the materiality of soil and land. So this is the question of the agency of land that you alluded to. So land is there, of course, where soil scientists dig for their soil samples and interpret the environment to understand its role in pathogenesis. It's there in situations where particular communities and governing institutions have been majorly impressed by the need for caring for soil. So I look at the history of crisis of soil exhaustion in 18th and 19th century colonial spaces. The ominous sand clouds during the US Dust Bowl event in the 1930s, or the ongoing loss of soil biodiversity around the globe and loss of soil organic matter in many agricultural sites today, which is a major concern to policymakers and governing institutions. Land is there where we eat, move, and live, and it's simultaneously always influenced by all these activities and informed and activities which are informed by the practices, technologies, and knowledges of soils, right? So the farmer choosing between different agricultural practices, maybe those based on contemporary soil scientific insights, which is a hot topic today. How can we promote more sustainable agricultural farmers? This is a big discussion in soil policy fora, or maybe farmers continue to reside on 20th and 19th century soil ontologies that are enshrined in chemical fertilizers, for example. Their soil informs the land and informs the land through the soil maps, which inform spatial planning policies, which in turn change the way land is used through the urban environments that affect soil formation processes, and through sewage systems that flush away our excrements. So all these material elements. And so to approach soil as an institution is to interrogate particular ways of institutionalizing and relating to the materiality of soils and lands. And the point here is that I think agencies of soil and land, if you wish to use the word agency here, which is of course hotly discussed and potentially problematic, we should start with the idea that they are all around in human practices and knowledges. So the land is there when you look at the dirty details of practices and you move away from a strictly conceptual, ideational, or epistemological approach to knowledge. I think that's an important point for me. So I always try to avoid two mistakes, two extremes. On the one hand, to understand the so-called actorness of soils and land in opposition to the human, and something to be interrogated in isolation from human practices. And on the other hand, to understand this actorness as something that can be reduced to whatever humans make of it, such as there's no space for surprise, which there obviously should be. And in the context of this surprise, so I started out by refraining to equate soil to land. And I think in a similar way, it's of course very important to recognize, and that's something I'm continuously interested in, how soil is always more than whatever these soil scientists that I partly look into make of it. And so we have heard many of the panelists today alluding to the various indigenous studies perspectives on land, soils, earth, and I think that that's very important, but also within the so-called modern or European, North American traditions, there are several ways of relating to the land. For example, there's a long tradition of soils being related to the political metaphysics of community, the distinction between autochthony and alloctony, so the citizen and the foreigner, which has gained, of course, a very dangerous prominence under the Nazi banner of Blut und Boden. And so there are different ways of soiling. There's different ways of approaching soil and understanding soils, also within certain tradition that can be grouped together in some sort of a familial way. And these different ways of relating to soils at times converge. For example, when soil scientists dedicate their work to Mother Earth, as they used to do in the 19th century, or when they promote today so-called non-mainstream local and indigenous farming practices as part of their policy discourse. Other times they diverge when biodynamic farming under the Nazi regime rejected mainstream scientific paradigms, chemical paradigms that influenced mainstream agronomic understanding of soils in the early 20th century. So this question of plurality then, the multifacetedness of soils and land. So at times in today's environmental humanities, this is approached through the concept of world, which I think it's a very provocative notion, but to me, it always rings a bit too much of this, let's say Heideggerian ring of closed totalities of meaning. And so I prefer to think of these questions in another Heideggerian term, because of course, fight Heidegger with Heidegger, the concept of ding or thing, which also plays a prominent role in today's science and technology studies, especially the French pragmatists, Latour, Stengers, their work on cosmopolitics. And thing here is a very old word that brings together three themes, which I think are important. So on the one hand, the materiality, the thingness of politics, centered as it is on what Latour and Stengers call matters of concern. Second, the idea that these matters of concern cannot be separated from the ways in which they are historically articulated, but also historically articulate, gather, and divide communities. And thirdly, this concept of thing highlights to me, and that's a bit Heidegger there, the elusiveness of such matters, their resistances in the way of withdrawing from worlds. So thinking with things, I find to be a productive way to understand the connectivities and the disconnectivities that things like soils and land generate in ways that are always rife with power, inequalities, and asymmetries. And but I find to be sort of my methodological anchor to approaching these kinds of questions. Very much looking forward to the discussion, so I'll end it here.
Thank you so much, Maarten. We'll move to the final speaker, Inanna Hamati-Ataya. You ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Not really.
I'm trying to control the canine companion, the human companion, but hopefully there will be no disruptions. Thanks very much, Felix. Thank you, Sam. And Felix, I wanted to start by congratulating you really on an absolutely fantastic series. And I wanted to thank all the contributors for their interventions and for all the discussions that were had over the past few weeks, which I thought were inspiring and were intellectually very stimulating, and also very interesting in the fact that they illuminated the fact that whatever your perspective or your methodology or the kinds of themes that you're approaching agriculture from, it all seems to be relevant to what you're doing. All the conversations, even if they were looking at different historical periods or different levels of analysis, or they were focusing on politics or culture or law, etc., it always seemed to be relevant to what other people were doing. And I think that it has to do really with the very nature of this topic, the fact that these relations that you were talking about, they crystallize in that sort of systemic coherence of all the themes and of all the different perspectives, so that whatever you're talking about, you're necessarily talking about other things as well, implicitly. So you asked us what I thought were quite difficult questions, but I thought I would share some of the challenges that I have been facing in my own research, and some of the lines of inquiry and the concerns that I've had in the past few years as I was developing a project, and I'm still developing that project, which looks at the history of agriculture as a sort of holistic history of how the development of human knowledge has really shaped what we have become as a cultural, social, and political species. And the first intuition was that agriculture was a perfect case to explore knowledge beyond all the dichotomies and reductionisms of the philosophy of science, of the sociology of knowledge, of all the different disciplinary perspectives on knowledge that sort of periodize the history of humanity in such a way that some cultures' knowledges are not knowledges, that some knowledges are superior to others, that we focus a lot on truth and we focus a lot on text, etc. And all the other reductionisms that we know of, the separation between practice and mind, intellectual labor and manual labor, technique, technology and science, ideas, etc. So I'm very happy that I think my intuition was very right. And I think that what this means, and this is the first point I want to highlight with respect to the epistemology of land and epistemology of agriculture, is that even if one is engaging the epistemology of agriculture in very general terms, it is incredibly valuable for developing the field of epistemology itself. And by developing it, I mean really transforming epistemology into a properly historical and empirical field of study that is capable of capturing the complex nature of human knowledge as it has actually emerged and evolved in our history. So not particular kinds of knowledges to the detriment of others, not knowledge in the way that philosophers or theorists imagine it to be or think that it should be, and certainly not only the knowledge that can be expressed in the form of ideas or statements of truth, which is what a lot of epistemological discussions in the realm of social science and humanities are about. How do we know what we know and what counts as truth, and et cetera, et cetera. So a deep engagement with the epistemic systems, the social and natural systems that constitute and drive agricultural life actually brings forth all the knowledges whose truth is actually embedded in actual life processes. And there are very few epistemologies or philosophies of knowledge in history that have endorsed that notion that truth is in the practice itself. It is not in the statement, it is not in the model, it is not in the philosophy, but the truth of a knowledge is in the success of its own practice. And agricultural practice is and especially, I think it's the most interesting and the richest way of engaging with that very fundamental notion. So we're talking about a knowledge that is embedded in real life processes. And as you and David mentioned in his intervention, this is where the relationality aspect that we've been talking about comes in and comes from. It's the relationality that's embedded in the multitudes of entangled processes of biological, physical, and cultural life that we as human beings are involved in. So that an epistemology of agriculture is necessarily an epistemology of all the relations in which knowledge is involved, all the relations that involve us as epistemic and cultural beings. So this is a sort of processual epistemology that can, of course, be developed out of many different kinds of systems of practice. But once we start looking at agriculture as more than just a mode of production, as more than just a system of techniques, it becomes obvious that from an anthropological perspective, it actually constitutes the overarching system within which most, if not all, systems of practice are inscribed and articulated. So the reason why I'm saying that is that I can no longer think about agriculture as a mere system of practice or a mode of subsistence, and certainly not as a mode of production, which is, I think, one of the most detrimental and harmful concepts that has developed across very different political and philosophical theories. I'm really thinking about agriculture as a paradigm of life. So this leads me to a very problematic point, which is that the more you engage with the deep history of agriculture, the total history of agriculture as a paradigm, you realize that there is very little in our cultural and social and political life that is outside of it. And so the agricultural paradigm appears to be the source and the structure of our major frames of understanding, which means that it's also the source and the structuring force of that produces all the tools that we deploy in our epistemological and theoretical constructs. So whether we're thinking about our relation to space, our relation to time, our relation to land as territory, land as field, our organization of time, the very concept of production, the very concept of management of labor, management of humans, of matter, of life, our relation to nature, so our ontology, our place within nature, our relation to other species, our conception of labor, the relation between land, labor, production, property, all the things that all the wonderful contributors to the series have mentioned, including also something that we haven't mentioned, which is how we have constructed our cultural and political identities also within the agricultural paradigm. That it's become very difficult to think of your culture outside of a territory, outside of a society, outside of sedentary life, or of identity and culture as being related to the food that you eat, to the way that you engage others within a certain social and cultural environment. So what I'm trying to say is that usually when sociologists of knowledge speak about the sources and the frames of understanding that shape the way that we study the world and understand knowledge itself, they speak of total ideology. But when they talk of total ideology, they often look for its structures in particular social institutions or particular social classes, and generally in the structures of a contingent social order. So it could be a gendered order, it could be an ethnic or cultural or class order, etc. And all the work in the sociology of knowledge has been focused on this very presentist approach to how ideology is produced. It's produced by existing major institutional or societal or economic structures. But it seems to me that the ultimate total ideology, the ultimate system of consciousness that sets the categories of our understanding and the tools that we use to assess our own knowledge is really the mental product of the agricultural paradigm. And it is this paradigm that has produced all the other social structures out of which these partial ideologies have emerged. So the state, a particular understanding of society, of social relations, the emergence of particular cultures, religions, art forms, etc., etc. And this is a problem because this is a kind of total ideology that is much more difficult to objectivate and to escape from than the kinds of ideologies that are produced by contingent social orders, from which one can escape at least by shifting positionalities or by inviting other people who are differently positioned to come as outsiders and give an external perspective on something that we are completely embedded in and cannot look at as something that is constructed. But we're no longer speaking now of the ideology of a group. We're speaking of the ideology of a whole species. So the question is, what kind of externality, what kind of outsider position, what kind of positionality might enable us to develop an epistemology of agriculture and of other realities that is not the product of the agricultural paradigm itself? And to me, this is not just a question of meta-epistemology, if you want. It's not just a question that is an intellectual one that operates within the domain of knowledge. It's also a question that has to do with practice as well. It has to do with how we can imagine different futures or imagine futures of our current present, but with different tools than those that led us to the present difficulties of our present. So the question is, what are the pathways to a denaturalization of what I would call now the agrarian ideology, which is the overarching ideology within which we construct our very epistemic tools? In purely abstract or logical terms, we need to explore the total ideology of a non-agrarian paradigm. In other words, we need to find a way to step outside of the agrarian paradigm and look at how reality and human life looks like and how people engage epistemically the world outside of that paradigm. So a lot of the interventions have shown the successful or insightful perspectives that are produced by looking at societies that are not entirely subsumed within the agrarian paradigm. So there are a few contemporary societies that one might call non-agriculturalist, or at least who practice forms of agriculture that are not entirely paradigmatic of intensive agriculture, of agriculture as a system of life. And indeed, anthropologists have looked at how their ontologies are remarkably different from the naturalist ontology that has characterized pretty much all of human history since the beginning of the agricultural revolution. I think that this is obviously a very insightful and productive angle. I also think that it carries lots of limitations, and one of them is to think about these current societies as if they were relics of an older time, or as if they were representative of an entirely different paradigm of hunter-gatherers, etc., etc. And of course, these assumptions have no basis. And so this is only this is one pathway towards denaturalization. And I think that we should continue to engage with these particular perspectives. And they seem to me to be much more productive than the perspectives that are actually still within the agricultural paradigm, but which we conceive of as anti-hegemonic or progressive or critical, although they in fact carry exactly the same kinds of epistemological categories in terms of production, in terms of what the land signifies in everyday life. The other solution, which I'm currently exploring, is to develop what we might call an evolutionary epistemology. So this means basically developing a theory of knowledge that is inscribed in not in the longue durée of history, but really in the evolutionary temporality and processes of the larger human history. And so extend our historical framework to the life history of humanity and even beyond it to our hominin ancestors. Because most of our life history as a species was spent within a different paradigm, what we call hunter-gatherer-forager or hunter-gatherer-fisher paradigm. And most of the evolutionary processes that have shaped us as a species were adaptive processes within that paradigm. And there are many ways in which actually our agrarian life is not adapted, or that we are not actually adapted to the agrarian life once we understand what we have inherited evolutionarily from these hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. But I'm going to focus on, just to end my intervention, focus on just a few points. If we start looking at how human beings were living before the rise of agriculture, there are some very easy observations that we can make. And we can identify very clearly different relations to the land, different understandings of the environment, different relations to time. There is no concept of production. There is a completely different temporality. There is a different understanding probably of labor. There is a different imagination, a different relation to the space of the living, etc., etc. So this can be very, very easily identified by the kinds of cultural products and the kinds of what we have, the traces that we have of how our ancestors lived before they were investing in a sedentary life and trying to extract from the land their full means of subsistence. They had knowledges of domestication, but this is a completely separate thing. There is something else, however, that transpires once we compare this evolutionary epistemology with what we call evolutionary aesthetics. And the comparison tells us something a bit more interesting and also a bit scary and very striking about how the agrarian paradigm has shaped our epistemology or our epistemic imagination. So evolutionary aesthetics looks at how the evolutionary processes that have produced us have shaped our aesthetic preferences beyond the cultural preferences that arise from being born in a particular environment and learning to appreciate specific things. And what is interesting is that these studies, which are very much grounded in environmental aesthetics and landscape aesthetics, show us that before we are completely socialized into a particular cultural environment, humans have broadly very similar aesthetic preferences. And these aesthetic preferences were shaped by our adaptation to the African savanna as a habitat. And the way that we respond emotionally to particular environments, landscapes, even architectural designs, is very much driven by the kind of needs that we had as hunter-gatherers. So for example, being able to have a view of the landscape so that we could hunt, but also in a way that we are hidden and protected enough so that we wouldn't be hunted, etc., etc. And so these studies in evolutionary aesthetics enable us to see what changed, how our development of agrarian life, and this includes both the development of rural life as well as urban life, because they are both the products of the agrarian paradigm, how this transformation affected our sense of aesthetics, but it didn't completely erase the evolutionary adaptations that we had. So I've been trying to find whether there are any residues of this in our epistemologies, and I'm finding it quite difficult actually to find something that is similar to what we find in evolutionary aesthetics, that is residues from hunter-gatherer evolution that are sort of hidden by the adaptation, the cultural adaptation to the agrarian paradigm. What we find actually is that the very basic the foundations of what I'm calling the agrarian ideology start very early on. As soon as the first hunter-gatherer societies start to shift to a more systematic agrarian or a soon-to-be agriculturalist relation to their land and to the environment, the first cultural manifestations of the agrarian ideology appear. And they appear in, for example, religious rituals, in a completely different conception of the mystical realm. So the transition between what you might call a hunter-gatherer religion to an agriculturalist religion appear very quickly. The art forms of the early agriculturalists are also substantially different from the art forms of the late hunter-gatherers. And so while I'm still trying to find there are major cognitive structures, of course, that are still the same because we are physiologically still the same. But in terms of the cultural aspect of our knowledge, what is striking is that the agrarian paradigm constitutes a real rupture or disruption in our evolution. And so this leads me to think that in addition to explaining why a lot of it is actually unnatural to us, it is very much entirely related to the development of our knowledges. And so there is a sort of meta problem, an epistemology of epistemology. I think Shailaja used that term a few weeks ago, that there is a metacognitive impact of the agricultural revolution that has transformed very substantially our epistemic imagination for the future. I'm not sure what I want to conclude from all that, but I find it quite striking that of all the technological innovations that we've had in our history, very few of them actually shifted our natural evolution. But the agricultural paradigm managed to do that in a way that seems to have put us on a completely different track. And I think that this is, at least certainly in philosophical and also in explanatory terms, in theoretical terms, something that should be explored. Because if we are to actually become able to imagine different futures, then we have to be able to think about what a different epistemology means. Otherwise, we will keep developing exactly the same tools that have led us to a sort of epistemic impasse. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Inanna. As I said in the beginning, many of the questions, I think that also got quite obvious now as you spoke, are very abstract and meta. But in order to learn something about them, also in your daily business, you have to go very much on the ground and go into the nitty-gritty. Because otherwise there is no anchor, no access point. And Maarten, I think, said that very well when he said you need to understand the dirty details of soil. And that's true, because land as an abstract category makes actually very little sense. And that's also why I like it. You need to go there and you need to see what it's like. I think in Shailaja's talk 2 weeks ago, that was very impressive how you described that all those seeds and the recipes and the way that people eat and consume and produce, you need to be there and see it and feel it. And of course, if it's in the past, you need proxies for that. But you need to be concrete. And that's why I think it's a great research topic, also for the grand questions that we're posing. There's always the danger of romanticizing. I think we've heard that as well. We don't want to romanticize subsistence or also indigeneity. We also don't want to drift into nationalism and nativism. I think, for example, in the framework of food sovereignty, which has been a great progressive tool for all kinds of struggles, there's sometimes the tendency of national governments to use that tool to frame themselves as agents for the people. But if you're being resettled, it doesn't really matter for you whether you're being resettled by the national government or by the World Bank. So we need to be more concrete. The land needs to be more than numbers, and in order to understand that, we need to be on the ground, as they say.